Today we will take a closer look at the advanced parameters in the amp block in the AxeFx 3. For those of you lucky owners of fractal audio products like the AxeFx 1, 2, 3 or maybe the X8 or the FM3, you may know that these units, they come with a shitload of parameters where you can adjust your amp sound to your taste. And I don't know if many of you are using the advanced parameters, but I found out that, at least for me, there are a couple of these advanced parameters which are very powerful, and I'm using them quite often. And I'd like to share that with you guys today, guys and girls, hopefully. And this is my patch. I'm using the Atomica High amp model, together with a IR from York Audio 4x12 recto standard mic with an SM57 at the low cut at 94 Hz. And I'm using my Harley Benton Fusion 2 HSH with a maple neck, maple fretboard, Roswell pickups, 5-way toggle, and a coil split. And well, this is the sound. And as you can see on the authentic page, you find the knobs which many of you are maybe familiar from real amps. You have the tone stack control, that is basically bass, middle, and treble, which is in most amps located after the preamp. And it's a tool where you can shape your overall distorted tone. The bass, mid, and treble knobs, they adjust specific frequency bands depending on the tone stack your amp. Also, you can adjust the amount of negative feedback in the presence and in the depth, so in the low end and the high end. And these are typically power amp parameters found on many modern amps. You have your gain knob, which is here called the input drive, a bright switch, which is maybe raising the presence frequencies, and also you have a knob called input trim, which can be used to boost the overall signal if the signal coming from the guitar is too low. But I leave it at 1 because I'm using usually a parametric EQ in front of the amp to shape the signal of the guitar. As you can see here, I'm boosting the guitar signal about 8 dB because these Roswell humbuckers here, I set them very low because they are a little bit bright in the top end, and that results in a low output of the guitar. Then I have to raise the level here a little bit. And also, I'm cutting the annoying harsh high end at 2K. I personally like to use the knobs on the second page, which are also the bass, middle, and treble control you saw before. But here we have access to another treble control, which is called high treble, and it's addressing a little bit of the higher frequencies in between maybe treble and presence. And yeah, I found it to be very powerful because with every amp you're not familiar with, you don't know which frequencies these knobs are addressing, and sometimes maybe the treble is not addressing what you would like to affect. So at least you have here 2 knobs where you can choose from. Also, you have here dedicated switches to cut the low end, or to emphasize the mids with the fat switch, or to emphasize some high end, which is especially used for clean amps. But to be honest, I don't do that much with these knobs, at least if the amp has a decent sound in the stock settings. But what I do use very often are some of the advanced parameters, and they start from the third page in my opinion, so I will show you them. third page is the preamp page, and as you may know, the modern high gain amps, they are shaping their tones mostly in the preamp section. So the tone stack is located after the guitar signal is distorted in most of these amps, and the tone stack, the bass, middle, treble control, they are adjusting specific frequency bands which are fixed depending on the amp model. And if you choose an amp model in the AxeFx, the default tone stack frequencies are selected for the bass, middle, and treble control, so that it should behave like the real amp in a way. But you could also change maybe the tone stack center frequency and shift the whole tone stack a little bit more up or a little bit more down. For example, the Marshall tone stack is located around the 600 Hz. If you would like to have more of a American tone stack, maybe like with the PV6505, you should reduce it a little bit. And as you can hear, suddenly, as I'm reducing some mids here and some bass, and it's shifted a little bit, you will get the upper mid-range punch like the PV6505. But with Marshall-like amps, you ride with the 600 Hz. Also, you could choose a tone stack from another amp. So, for example, now I'm playing the Atomica, which is basically maybe like a modified Marshall, but you could choose the tone stack of maybe the PV6505. And suddenly it sounds like a 6505. So if you like the behavior of your amp, but you would like to have the tone stack from another amp, you could switch it here. And there's some amps, for example the Friedmans or also the 6505, I must say, which have a very usable tone stack in my opinion. So let's go back to the Atomica tone stack. And last but not least, you can change the position of the tone stack here. As most high gain amps, the tone stack is located after the distortion stages. The bass, middle, and treble controls acting like tone shaping tools where you can adjust your sound. But in some amps, like most popular maybe the Mesa Mark series amps, they are located pre-gain, and you can switch this here in the tone stack location. In this case now, the bass, middle, and treble control are shaping the guitar signal before it is distorted, and then what you're doing with the bass, middle, and treble, it's basically you're boosting the signal like you would do with an overdrive in front of the amp. And as you may know, with the Mesa Mark amp series, it's very popular to boost the mids and maybe treble and reduce the bass. And that doesn't do much to the sound, but it adds saturation to the amp. The actual sound shaping is then done with the Mark amp series with an output EQ, which is the 5-band EQ you find on the real amp. So I recommend you to have an eye on that, especially if you're not familiar with an amp, then you may know how the tone stack is functioning, especially if you're pre-selected. Then you have to dial in the amp completely different than most other amps with their post-gain tone stack location. Another important thing is, you may have seen, I selected the input boost on the second page, but here you could choose the behavior of the boost. For example, you could choose a neutral boost, basically boosting the overall signal of the guitar, but you could also use, like I do now, the full tone overdrive or another pedal, maybe the Tube Screamer 808, but you could just address here the level of the applied pedal. If you would like to have more control about the boost type, then you should use a drive pedal, dedicated drive block, where you can choose from much more pedals, and also you have access to much more parameters. For example, you could set a low or high cut here. But for many applications, maybe this will be enough. If you like your TS8 08 with everything at noon except level at max and distortion at minimum, then maybe you can choose the input boost. Also important is the low and high cut that happens after the preamp, because that is something which is very different and depending on the amp. Especially with high gain amps, it's not uncommon that they have low cut very high. For example, if you choose the Angel Severe model, which is a model of an Angle Savage 120, you can see it's around 460 Hertz. That means basically all the low mids and basses coming from the power amp with this amp model. And with the Atomica, set at 10 Hertz. But in my opinion, it tends to get a little bit floppy, so I like to raise it. And also, if your preamp seems to be too harsh, then you can reduce the high cut a little bit here. So I'd recommend to have a look at these two knobs, especially if your amp has too much low end or too much high end. And I look here before I start EQing the amp with the equalizers. Of course, you can switch to another preamp tube. That is something usually I don't do, but you can experiment with that. And another important thing is the preamp hardness control. That is something which is not leading to differences in the sound. More or less, but it feels very different. Some people like the preamp to react a little bit more spongy, more soft, so to speak, to your picking, and other people like it more with more compression. Then I'd recommend to experiment with the hardness knob here. In the power amp section, especially with high gain amps, I don't do that much because, as I said before, most of the tone shaping is happening in the preamp. One important thing here is the negative feedback, which is basically the amount of the signal that is coming back from the output of the power amp back to the input. And many of the modern amps have this feature to reduce floppiness in the bass. If you reduce this, then these knobs, presence and depth, they don't have much of an effect here. But if the negative feedback, the amount of negative feedback is very high, then these knobs have much more effect. So I definitely recommend to have a look at the negative feedback just to know how the amp behaves. For example, a dual rectifier doesn't have a negative feedback, and the result is that the amp is really floppy in the low end. So with that model, maybe I can show you. Here we go, Rector 1 red. As you can see, negative feedback is not happening. Also, the preamp low cut frequency is set very low, so I would start to raise this. Also, it's fizzy as hell. I will reduce this, and then I would start to raise the negative feedback at least a little bit. I need to use the depth and presence controls something I would do, especially with these amps like the dual rectifier that don't have negative feedback. If you want to use it in a high gain scenario, I would recommend to play around with that knob at least a little bit. Don't need to crank it, might get too mid-focused and then the amp loses totally its character. But you can raise it a little bit and then maybe it will help. But other than that, I don't do much here. Also on this page, the power supply. You can reduce the variac a little bit if you would like to get more of a brown sound, like the early Eddie Van Halen sounds. And the amp feels to have a little bit more attack. But other than that, I don't go on this page very often. Also on the speaker page, this is the page where you can adjust the impedance curve to your IR, so that maybe the power amp section is reacting better with the cabinet in the real world. You can choose from different impedance curves, but also here the IRs and the AxeFx, they come from third parties, and also they're mic'd in a certain way. So if you choose maybe a rector cab like I do now, it's not said that these impedance curves from the rector cabs, which are here modeled, they fit the actual IR. So that is more or less something you could try out, but usually I leave it at my favorite grid green band. Okay. On this page also I don't do much. In fact, I think I've never used it. But the next two pages are very important for me. You have in the AxeFx 3 these two dedicated equalizers. One is the input EQ, which is, as the name says, located at the input of the amp before it hits the gain stage. What you can do there, as I mentioned before, with the pre-gain tone stack, you can use this equalizer to boost your signal. And for example, a very common trick, especially with Marshall-like amps, is to boost the 800 Hz in a wide bandwidth. And now we have the Recto Red model, but just for the sake of doing it, we will try it. A little bit of mid boost is always welcome. And also, you could cut the lows of the guitar signal and cut the highs, like your favorite Tube Screamer is doing. Suddenly we have a usable high gain tone out of a dual rectifier. So this is something I'm using quite a lot, but also, as you can see, I am using a parametric EQ in front of the amp, which is even more flexible. In this case, I'm just boosting the overall signal and setting a high cut at 2K. But even if I turn it off, just with these settings, the amp seems to sound okay. The most important page for me is the output EQ, and that is basically the equalizer that is used for to shape the overall tone of the amp. And the reason why I tend to use this is, well, here I know which frequencies are affected. As in the amp, especially if the default tone stack is selected, it's depending on the real amp which frequencies are addressed by the bass, the mid and the treble knob, and also how they interact with each other. For example, if you have something like the rectifier like we do now, on the real amp, if you crank the treble, then the other two knobs, they will have less effect. than if you set the treble at a very low value, and suddenly the bass and mid, they come into the picture. And that is something that has to do with the architecture of the tone stack. They're basically working in a row, so they affect each other, but they do a rectifier, as far as I know. And that is something which is not easy to use, and well, as I said, it depends on the amp, which tone stack is there implemented. And so I like to use to keep this at noon, especially with the amps that have an overall okay sound, and do the overall tone shaping with the output EQ. And for the Marshall-like amps, I like to use the 7-band EQ with a variable Q. It means basically that they don't have all the same bandwidth, which is, in my opinion, logic. Yeah, well, it's intelligent to do so because these frequencies, they are logarithmically and not linear, so maybe the difference here between 200 and 400, it's maybe 200 Hertz, but between 1.6K and 3.2K, it's about 1.6K. So you have to affect a little bit wider range of frequencies, similar effect. So I use this to shape the overall tone, and especially with Mesa amps, you have the ability to use the famous Mesa Mark amp series 5-band graphic EQ, and you could set your V shape here, or also if you are satisfied with the sound and you just want to reduce the overall mids a little bit, maybe then you can choose an easier EQ like the 3-band console. The dynamics page, I don't do anything. I use the dynamic presence, dynamic depth quite a little bit in the AxeFx 2. That is something, as the name says, which is adjusting the presence and depth parameters depending on your playing. So if you hit the note harder and you set it higher, then maybe it will sound a little bit louder than if you hit the note lower with a lighter attack. But in the AxeFx 3, I didn't use it. So I hope this helps you. Basically, I'm using the adjustments on the preamp section, and together with the input EQ and the output EQ. I'd recommend to take a look at the negative feedback amount in the power amp section. And other than that, of course, you could play around with these knobs, but if you don't get good results with bass, middle, and treble, I'd recommend to leave them and do the overall shaping here in the output EQ section. So I hope it helps you to get the best sound out of your AxeFx, and please post your comments below, hit like and subscribe, and well, send me cash or show me your girlfriends, whatever. See you soon. Bye.